Hello, everyone. My name is Roy Culpeper. I'm the chair of the group of 78. I'd like to welcome you all to this panel on infrastructure adaptation. Just briefly by way of background, those of you who attended our opening session featuring keynote Jayati Ghosh yesterday will have been treated to a superb overview of the global financial and economic context within which particularly developing countries must work in order to mobilize the resources they need to address climate change. So from that rather grand overview of the global system and how it works or doesn't work, we're going to start drilling down to look at how we must understand and address the challenges and opportunities facing us because of climate change and climate change adaptation in particular, starting with today's panel on infrastructure adaptation. And in order to do that, I'm going to call upon my friend and colleague, John Stone, who's agreed to moderate this panel. So briefly by way of introduction, John Stone is adjunct professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University. He received his PhD in chemical spectroscopy from the University of Reading, and since retiring from the Canadian Public Service in 2005, he's been a number of things, including visiting fellow International Development Research Centre. He was a member of the Bureau of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and most recently a lead author for the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. He's a board member of the Pembina Institute. And I should also add that John has been a very key member of our working group on climate change at the Group of 78, the working group that has morphed into the climate to the conference planning committee, the committee that has planned this conference. And he's been immensely helpful in guiding us in putting together not only this conference, but in our thinking and action on climate issues. So thank you, John, for moderating this panel, and over to you.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Roy, for the introduction, and thank you to all those who helped put this together. To start with, I would like to explore with you this afternoon the question of, can our infrastructure worldwide be modified or rebuilt to be more sustainable in a changing climate? An observation, regardless of the now inevitable climate change that we can expect over the next decade or more, it's most likely that we're going to have to upgrade or renovate existing infrastructure. In addition, we will be constructing new infrastructure for producing and distributing renewable energy, for making our homes and businesses use energy more efficiently, and building carbon neutral transportation systems, for example. So this notion of taking advantage of the infrastructure investments that we expect to make anyway to facilitate adaptation to climate change was first raised by Nicholas Stern in his magnus opus in 2006, The Economics of Climate Change. The built environment offers, and in some cases demands, wise adaptation strategies to deal with the threats such as sea level rise that will affect billions of people living in low-lying coastal settlements, overland flooding as a result of intense rainfall, especially for communities built on floodplains, and heat waves that are accentuated because of the way we have built our cities. Investing in infrastructure will clearly create new jobs, new opportunities for training across the country. And these opportunities will complement actions that will also need to be taken post-COVID-19 to address some of the shortcomings that we have been revealed in our social and our economic spheres. For example, one might draw a parallel with how Canada retooled its industry and labour force during and even more so after World War II. So the sort of questions that we are posing for ourselves are, can we design policy initiatives that facilitate not only adaptation to expected impacts of anthropogenic climate change, especially extreme events, but also revitalize the built environment and provide new human and economic opportunities, a clear case for identifying ancillary benefits. Can we also envisage nature-based adaptation solutions that not only protect us from impacts of climate change, but also build sustainable ecosystems? And what should we expect from the public sector in adapting to climate change? And what can be left to the private sector? Finally, although governments in poorer countries have to be responsible for their own infrastructure, what measures should Canada and other rich countries take to help such countries adapt their infrastructure to climate change? So those are some of the facets of this issue, this debate, or this session this afternoon. And I've just to recall what's written in your program, if I may just read it. Regardless of climate change, governments and businesses will continue to spend significant amounts of money building new and maintaining existing physical infrastructure in order to provide services and create new products. So there's this interaction then between infrastructure and climate change that we hope to explore this afternoon. And to do that, we've got two excellent speakers who have agreed to share this afternoon with us. Friends of mine for a long time, colleagues who have worked on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. We have Paul Kovacs, who is the founder and to continue drive behind the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and Adam Fenech from the University of Prince Edward Island, with a title yet to be determined, but having been reappointed as Dean. So I'd like to ask Paul to speak first for about 20 minutes, and then we'll ask Adam, and we'll finish this whole session up within an hour and a half. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. It's a delight to be here. Great to spend time with you, John, and with you, Adam. And I very much look forward to our conversation today. For everybody who's taken the time to join us, please do everything you can to reduce your emissions. Please do everything you can to adapt and prepare. There are ways that we can be more resilient to the climate that is here and is coming. You can protect your home and other things. And in addition to acting yourselves, encourage others. So thank you for joining us. And I really look forward to our conversation today. As John mentioned, the focus today is on public infrastructure. There's a much bigger agenda on the climate agenda, but we're going to zoom in on one of the really critical parts. I look forward with Adam to setting the stage for the conversation that will come afterward. So let me jump right in. There we go. It does advance. I'm going to quickly talk in the short introductory piece of mine on 5 different issues related to adapting public infrastructure for our changing climate. So first, I want to talk about why public infrastructure is vulnerable, why the focus on this part of a very broad set of things we need to do about climate change. Second, I want to talk about why we're going to need to spend a lot of money. To do this right, it costs money, infrastructure in particular. Number 3, we know what to do. There are some topics that we're still having conversations. Infrastructure, this is pretty clear. We know what the next steps are. Number 4, one of the tools that we're responsible for at our institute is called the IPCC protocol. I'll just give you a quick sense of what that is. And then I want to close across the many different things, why some of us believe as infrastructure moves more to the top of the list than many of the other things we also need to do. But if there isn't time or energy or funding to do everything, why infrastructure typically comes out right at the top of the list of things that need to be addressed. So these are the 5 things I'm going to quite quickly cover in the time I have available. And then after Adam is done, I look forward to the conversation we'll all have together. Essentially, I got one slide on each of these, so I'll put up a slide and just chat with you a little bit. Our infrastructure is vulnerable. So first, Canada and actually a number of countries around the world, put a lot of money and effort into our public infrastructure in the 1950s and 1960s. Built our roads, put up our bridges, made a number of really big commitments to put together the systems that support our society. This was a very exciting period for anybody involved in this space. A lot of thought, a lot of energy was put into putting down the roots that support where we are today. We have now gone through a fairly long period, like 50 years now, where we have not really taken good care of our infrastructure. The thought process about our public infrastructure is just not in the same state that it was in that period of the 50s and 60s. A lot of systems are now very old. Infrastructure is meant to last a long time, but some of it, we're reaching the end of what should have been expected of these systems. They did their job. We did a good job in the 50s and 60s, but we're coming to the end of what we should expect from them. The systems have been running down. Each year we get a year older. Each year our systems get a year older. And over decades, it starts to add up. It's not that we've done nothing. We have been spending on infrastructure. We've been sometimes replacing things, definitely taking care of things. But most of the analysis, in most circumstances, I'm generalizing here, which is always a dangerous thing. In most circumstances, we have not invested enough to maintain the kind of service that we enjoyed 50 years ago. Our systems are less capable of what they used to be. These systems are different than some other things. I had a haircut recently, and pretty soon I'll have to go get another haircut. I mean, there's some things that just keep coming back again and again. They have a very short life, and you have to take care of them all the time. By definition, what we mean by public infrastructure are these foundations that support us, and most of them are expected to last a long time. They are to provide service over decades, not over months and years, over decades. And so we want to get it right, and we want to take care of them. The decisions for a lot of our infrastructure that is in place today, supporting us today, involve climate. You know, what is the climate as we're building this road, as we put up this bridge, as we take care of our systems? And they were designed using what the climate used to be. Our climate has already changed, and there's a lot coming. This is what our conversation is about with climate change. And our infrastructure is vulnerable because it wasn't designed for today, let alone tomorrow's climate, in many cases, not all. And again, my apology for generalizing. I'm just trying to set the stage here. I hope that's helpful for the conversation. A lot of money is needed. So our systems are not providing the service that we used to expect of them. Potholes as you go down the road. This is a picture of a sewer system, and it's raining hard and water's coming out of the sewer because there's so much water and the system's being overwhelming. Those responsible for these systems, most of them are municipal, but there's provincial and federal systems. Just an awful lot of our infrastructure happens to be locally owned. The local officials know this system has gone beyond what it's capable of or what it used to be able to do. And some need to be replaced. Others just, it's the care and nourishment. But again, a lot of them are very old. It's not this is unknown. So very large announcements have been made by local governments, by provincial governments, by the government of Canada. Greater spending on infrastructure is a priority. It has been stated. This is something we as a society intend to spend more money on. I'm much more familiar, and most of my conversation today is going to be about the Canadian context. I'm aware this is a global conversation. John was asking us, can we handle this worldwide? Well, this is happening all around the world. Our infrastructure has not been taken care of to the level that we really used to expect. And so there are announcements being made across Canada, but also around the world, of more money to be spent on infrastructure. And that money is coming from all different levels of government. This is a global priority. There is an immediate acknowledgement that our infrastructure needs to be dealt with. Our conversation today is climate change and infrastructure. I'm not sure that everywhere in all circumstances that the link to climate change is always made. But there is absolutely a link that our infrastructure is old. It needs more renewal. It needs more care. It needs more attention. Climate change is one of many reasons why that's the case. We actually know what to do, how to take care, how to replace, how to do things, how to do this properly. There's a graphic on here. This is part of an initiative that was funded by the Government of Canada through the Treasury Board Secretariat, and was conducted by the Canadian Council of Academies. And we put together an expert panel that I was part of. And the question asked of us was, if there's not enough money and resources to deal with everything on climate change, what are the most important ones? Where can you do the most? And I'll show you a second slide later that summarizes all of this. This is where I'm going to close. But one of the questions asked of the expert community, of the damage expected in a particular area, how much of that can be avoided through adaptation? So for infrastructure, the graphic here shows that the experts said 80% of the damage expected over the next 20 years to our public infrastructure is avoidable through what we already know. If we simply did it, if we were able and chose to spend money on adapting our public infrastructure, we can avoid more than 80% of the damage. We can avoid a lot of damages in a lot of areas, but there is no topic that has the greater capacity to avoid damage through adaptation than public infrastructure. We know what to do. One of the really exciting areas that is advancing quickly right now is to take this knowledge and turn it into codes and standards, make it immediately accessible to all of those decision makers across Canada so that they can move forward and protect our sewers, protect our bridges, protect our roads, all of our public infrastructure. The science is in great shape, and some of it is so far along that it qualifies to go into codes and standards. And in places where it's not completely consensus-based, we have a lot of knowledge, and there's a lot that can be done. One of the areas that has moved forward, but there's more to be done, is climate models. We know how to protect our infrastructure, but do we know what climate to protect it from? Some areas like heat and precipitation, the knowledge is really good. If you want to look out 20 years, you want to look out 50 years, we have a very narrow sense. The heat will probably get to this sort of level or in this narrow range. Precipitation, we know pretty well. Some of the other climate predictions, the further out you get, the harder it is. So what is it you need to prepare for? There's more uncertainty on the climate side, but there's a real sense what you would do if the risk comes. So the climate models are advancing very quickly and are much better shape and are getting much more localized. We're not talking about the world. We're now talking about a very specific location. What will the heat be? What will the precipitation be? And what are some of the hazards? There are a lot more tools how to manage these risks. In particular, asset managers responsible for our public infrastructure have tools to integrate climate change into the process. There's many different things that they need to deal with, but climate change can now be built into that. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the IPCC protocol that we've now assumed responsibility for, but there's climate lands. There's a whole series of tools that are far more advanced than they were before in terms of help managing these risks. The IPCC protocol, this was funded by the Government of Canada through Engineers Canada. ICLR and our partners are now with responsibility for this as one tool. This is to help infrastructure managers understand this is freely available to anybody responsible for public infrastructure, local, provincial, federal governments. It's been applied in many different circumstances, helps pull everybody together to truly use our knowledge about climate change and about engineering and apply that to the management of our infrastructure. We've even got a group, back to John's request, that has started to take this Canadian tool and take it worldwide. We're partnering with the German government, and we've been in almost a dozen countries now around the world. And specifically with IPCC, we've done more than 120 different projects. One of the things we ask for these projects is when you're done, write a report. So I think there's 75 reports on our website if you want to go read them. Here's how we adapted for climate change for all different kinds of circumstances. So we are one of the tools out there. and how to use science to better manage infrastructure, the knowledge is there. You need to get on with it. I'm moving to wrap up here. I just have 2 more slides. So I mentioned that the Canadian Council of Academies set up an expert panel on climate change and adaptation potential. The expert community were asked for a number of different hazards. What is the likelihood something really bad will happen in the next 20 years? And what are the consequences if that bad thing happens? So we found for Canada, there are lots of different areas we're worried about. We've got more than a dozen here where it's quite likely and will be very bad. Amongst all of these areas that are vulnerable in our country, and I apologize for the small print and it's hard to read all the details here, the one where the likelihood was the greatest and the consequences would be the greatest, we are really sure was infrastructure. So when the expert community were asked of all the things you're worried about, what is really certain to happen and what will be really bad, physical infrastructure was the one that came up the most often of all the many things we're worried about. And as I mentioned, it's also the one where there's the most knowledge about what do you do about it. So infrastructure stands a little bit separate from many different areas that are important to work on. All of them, that was a part of our report, all should be addressed. One that stands out a little bit is infrastructure amongst a long list of things where we really need to take climate change and adapting to climate change to a higher level. So my very last slide, and thank you everybody for listening. Remind to everybody, please do all you can to reduce your emissions. Please do all you can to prepare for the new climate. It's already changed and more is coming. You're aware of the report that says our warming in Canada is going at twice the rate of the rest of the world on average. So do everything you can and tell others that they can do things too. Specifically for infrastructure is going to be a huge part of public spending for as far out as you want to look. We've got billions of dollars of planned spending on public infrastructure. We want to get this right. This is our money, and we don't want to spend it and then need to replace it in a few years because we didn't do it right. Make sure that we take today's climate and the coming climate that we know about and take that into account as public money is spent on infrastructure. The goal is to get service from this public infrastructure. It needs to deliver. You want to be able to get down the road safely. You want to get your electricity on time, all of those sorts of things. We want to make sure that we get services because our infrastructure is done right. The science is quickly advancing and in many cases ready to already be put into codes and standards so that it can further accelerate. What do? You don't have to go around looking at, you just do what's in the standard where it's possible. And there's a process underway for Canada that is moving very well in our country. Decisions about infrastructure, climate change is one of many different things that need to be taken into account. It needs to be mainstreamed in the overall process. And one of the pieces that our institute's been working on is trying to build a community of experts able to work on this using tools like PyVC and other tools that are available. But there needs to be a community who really understand the specifics, the details under different circumstances about how this can move forward. And that community is informed and growing and moving from here. So, John, thank you for the opportunity. I hope that was a useful introduction to the conversation today about climate change, how we can adapt, and in particular, what is possible on infrastructure so that we can be more prepared for the climate that we have and the climate that's coming and the threat that will bring to our infrastructure. So, John, thank you for the opportunity to speak first.
Thank you very much, Paul. That is clearly, you've benefited from your 20 years of experience at the Institute and involvement with the IPCC to condense it into just 5 slides. Really very important and a lot to think about. I'm, compared to many people around the table this afternoon, a youngster in Canada, although I've been here for about 30, 50 years. But when I arrived in the late 70s or early 70s, I can't remember now, it was quite clear there was a huge amount of investment in infrastructure. All the subway system in Montreal, in Toronto, 401, the Queensway in Ottawa. There's just a huge amount. And that was it. Then we stopped investing and it's slowly deteriorating. So that's why we can take advantage of these investments, which we're going to have to make anyway, to at the same time protect us against the worst ravages of climate change, particularly extreme events. So can we go on to Paul Adam's talk? So Adam,
John,
the floor is yours.
John, before you do so, with your indulgence, may we ask Paul what IPCC stands for?
Oh, good. I was going to ask that.
Sorry, Roy. IPCC?
No,
Or ICR?
IPCC, what does it stand for?
IBC?
PIEVC.
The PIVC. The PIVC.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Roy. My apology. Trying to condense the conversation. Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee. Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, for the question.
Adam, you're on.
I'm on. Thank you so much. First, thank you, John, for the invitation, and Paul, thank you for the lead-in, the context for what's going on. If you noticed, as well as I did, that the second to infrastructure was coastal systems in that adaptation plan. So here I'm going to be merging the two of those to tell you about the very specific, about how here on Prince Edward Island, how we're being impacted and how we're adapting to climate change. And I guess arguably Prince Edward Island is probably one of the most heavily impacted places in Canada. Certainly Canada's north is more strongly impacted. That's because the forcing agents are. But certainly in southern Canada, we could say that Prince Edward Island is at the forefront of climate change impacts. Let's put things into context for Prince Edward Island. It's, relatively small, relatively large, something like that. It's 5,600 square kilometers, making us just over the 100th largest island in the world and the 23rd largest in Canada. Certainly we're the smallest province in Canada, that's for sure. But I put this up here because I want to show how vulnerable the island is to coastal erosion, because we have a lot of coastline as well. Most people will not see that officially Prince Edward Island has this many kilometers of coastline, but I like to include all of the estuaries and all those little bits that you see on this island here, which makes us, you can't go very far without seeing the water here on Prince Edward Island. We are particularly sensitive to coastal erosion. We are essentially a large sandbar. We're made up of sand and sandstone. The sea levels are rising. We have a tidal gauge in Charlottetown that's been around for about 100 years. And it's recorded that we've had about a 32 centimeter rise in sea level. And depending on who you talk to, we do have to anticipate somewhere between 1 or 2.7 meters over the next 100 years. So that whole risk, or the whole vulnerability, will be increasing over the next while. The land itself, EEI, is falling as well. Not too much. I mean, it's only 10 to 20 centimeters per century, depending which side of the island is, but it's certainly going in the wrong direction. But probably most important is the changing winter ice cover. And the whole seasonality of our sea ice has been changing, where we used to have these long seasons that started the end of November until April sometime, that used to surround the island and protect it from storm and wave activity. It's now limited to pretty much 6 weeks during the months of January and February. And this has really added to our threat of erosion. So here's an extreme example. This is Emmett McKenna's lot. He bought 3 acres from his uncle back in 1955 for $55 an acre. And you can see now the whole lot is underwater. You can see also that Emmett's property is not the only one that's underwater. So almost within my own lifetime, people have had waterfront property here on Prince Edward Island that have gone completely underwater. So researchers took a look at the change. They looked at every single meter of Prince Edward Island from 1968 to 2010 and looked at the average. And the average turned out to be about 28 centimeters per year. So that's about a foot per year. Again, I kind of wish it was going the other way. It'd be better if our island was growing rather than shrinking. But we didn't really know if a foot was a lot or not, especially in reference to coastal infrastructure. So what we did is we took the change that happened at every single meter and we multiplied it by 30, 60, 90 years to see what might be vulnerable. So here's an example. This is the sewage lagoons on Lennox Island, PEI's First Nation Reserve. And the black line is 1968, the blue line is 2010. And then, so for every meter, we multiplied it by 30, 60, 90 to give us an idea under current rates of erosion, what type of infrastructure is going to be vulnerable. Well, we came up with this list, over 1,000 homes and cottages, 17 lighthouses, 48 kilometers of road, one wind turbine. So we should have known better and made sure it was built further away from the coast, because that was only built in the last 15, 20 years. But at least it gave us something for the small island of Prince Edward Island with 150,000 human population. Like 1,000 homes and cottages is quite a large number and is of great concern. And if we took up that small change that occurred around the island and we added it all up between 1968 and 2010, we come up with 35 square kilometers that was lost, almost 15 square kilometers that was gained, because in some places of the island we're actually growing. Overall, that's a loss of about 20 square kilometers. That's about 5,000 acres, or about half the size of Charlottetown. Now, the island's not going anywhere fast. It would take about 10,000 years for the island to completely disappear at those rates, even though we believe those rates are increasing. We're already seeing places where, we're getting erosion rates of up to 5 meters per year. 5 meters. Think about that. 5 meters per year. You might leave your summer cottage, come back the next year, and you've got 5 meters gone from your property forever. This is happening here on the island. So how are we adapting to things? Well, we're doing a lot of monitoring. I think it's really important that we capture the change that is occurring. So every decade we do that type of study where we look at every meter. And then in between, we've developed this early warning system where we have over 100 places where we put pins in the ground and measure the coastline directly. We have the largest fleet of drones of any university, and we fly the coastline at over 100 places, so we can see year to year how things are changing. And at the bottom, you'll see there, in addition to that one Department of Fisheries and Oceans tidal gauge in Charlottetown, we've put in 7 already, and we're putting in another 10 before the end of this calendar year, just to give us an idea of the vulnerability to storm surge activity and an early warning system for when things are, the seas are rising and might be causing some damage on wharfs and the infrastructure that's around the small wharves of Prince Edward Island. This is some of the imagery that comes from our drones. We've been at it for it will be 6 years. This is our 6th field season. We have captured the imagery for this area here. It's called Savage Harbor, but we haven't processed the data, analyzed the data yet. But this run of beach here is over 1.3 kilometers. And you can see year to year in the little yellow box on the right-hand side that 2.6 meters were lost on average at this 1.3 kilometer area 1 year. Then it was just a little bit. It was only about 7 centimeters. Then it went up to 4.29 meters. And the most recent year we've been able to analyze is it's lost 1.84 meters. And so you can see those red areas on this map here are areas where the erosion rates are more than 1.5 meters. There's still some areas that are accreting or growing. You can see the blue at the tip of the graph here, the map here. These types of maps are really important for when engineers want to get in and start looking at the dynamics of the wave and see where the erosion rates are happening. In addition to monitoring, we've got to do our adaptation just through knowledge building. And we've been doing a lot of public consultations. We developed this tool. It's called Clive, Coastal Impacts Visualization Environment. It's basically a video game, realistic one. You can fly over the island, raise and lower sea levels, click on and off coastal erosion rates. And it's been very effective as a tool of virtual reality. We've won some awards from MIT. We've exported the technology to the city of Los Angeles, and we've worked in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as well. But we took this Clive tool and our knowledge about how PEI is vulnerable to coastal erosion, the historical and undercurrent rates, what that might mean for the future, to 16 different communities across PEI in 2 years, 2014 and 2018. And I dragged along a master's student from Carleton University, where I'm an adjunct professor. And so we were able to show scientifically that the knowledge and the awareness of these coastal issues increased. The concern increased. So even if it was high, it went to very high. And most importantly, the willingness to take action or to adapt also increased. And we've also been out in the media. We've had some pieces on the National, Al Jazeera, Globe and Mail, just to get the word out that this is a problem. Because we get these people, especially this summer, from central Canada who are coming out and purchasing property sight unseen, mostly because it's very close to the coastline, without knowing that these issues are real threats. And they might not have their beautiful home or cottage in the coming years due to all the vulnerability that I've talked about earlier. Probably what you'd expect to talk about is adaptation through protection, right? And most of it's armoring. So I've flown a low-flying plane over, not me personally, I wasn't the pilot, but my research group took a low-flying plane over the whole coastline of Prince Edward Island, and we were able to document all coastal structures, of which there were about 172 kilometers of that length, representing about 5% of Prince Edward Island. So that's the amount of coast that's protected. The concerns we have is that these are some of the examples that we found. So if you look at the upper left, we're looking at construction waste that people threw into a concern with erosion. The upper right, I don't know if you can really tell that there, but those are gravestones. They weren't used gravestones. They were, I don't know, maybe it was a mistake made in carving into the granite, but people have thrown gravestones in. At the lower right, you're looking at a bunch of tires that were filled with cement as a way to try and protect the coastline from, these incoming waves and storm activity. In the middle at the bottom, you'll see that this nice wall was erected out of these stones, flat stones. Well, that won't look like that after 1 year, 2 years. It'll probably be gone in about 5 or 6 years. The oceans are just too strong here. What seems to work is on the lower left, which is you erect a really big, huge defense, one of these pretty seawalls that you're seeing here, that rust out and certainly ruin your view and get rid of your beach. So it's a real challenge for Prince Edward Island. Like, what do we do? One of the things is make sure you don't build so darn close to the shore, but we already have this historical infrastructure that's already too close. What do we do about it? So there are some tests that are being done. We have something called living shorelines. And we have not had any success with these yet here on Prince Edward Island. Let me just put it that way. And it's primarily because, again, the sea's activity around PEI are just too strong. We're seeing very large winter storms. Those nor'easters that you hear about really hit the island hard on the North Shore. On the South Shore, in the Northumberland Strait, which is the water body between Prince Edward Island and mainland Canada, the tidal activity goes around the island twice a day and meets in the middle of the strait. And that constant flow of water back and forth does cause some huge problems with erosion. So some of them that you're seeing here, the one on top was a group. They might even have a trademark on the idea of living shorelines. And so it's a bunch of old logs and some stumps that they hammer into the ground just to make sure that everything is not going to move too much. They put bales of hay. There we go. As well, and they plant a lot of local vegetation, just plants and trees. But like I said, it hasn't had any success yet. The group at the lower right-hand side are these 18 interns who work for the climate lab at the University of Prince Edward Island. And here they are putting one to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Charlottetown. We're trying our best. It's more in an estuary, so we're hoping that it'll have a better effect. Some of the better approaches that we're taking, and I must applaud Prince Edward Island Department of Infrastructure for, certainly early on understanding the impacts of climate change and wanting to do something about it. They've realized that fighting against the sea is a losing battle. It's very expensive too. And so they've started to adopt ways of adaptation that works well with the natural environment and the large forces of nature. So what we're looking at the bottom left of the screen are these breakwaters made of island stone. So we don't have this foreign stone. We don't have any hard stone here naturally on Prince Edward Island. So when we do import the rocks and put them out on the coast, we almost feel like it's an invasive species because we're seeing the gray color. So we like to see this nice red stone. It's not very strong, like it does wear down fairly quickly in comparison to a granite stone. But when it does wear down, it just creates sand. And so what these breakwaters have done, this is a Surrey Causeway. And what it's done is it's slowed the tidal activity, which has then dropped the sediment out and has built these beaches. So you can almost see it here. This has only been in 2.5 years' time. It looks as if we have almost 6, maybe 7 meters of additional beach that's been created just by putting these stones, island stones, and they were left over from some big construction project that was happening on Prince Edward Island. And you put those down, work with nature, creates a larger beach, which everybody loves, right? Everybody wants to play on the beach, but that beach also protects the causeway. They put up a seawall about 5-6 years ago. It was taken down, damaged severely 4 years after that by a winter storm. It wasn't a huge storm. And so then Department of Infrastructure on PEI decided to build this type of response. So we're adapting with in ways here. So in conclusion, PEI is really sensitive. We're essentially just a sandbar, right? We're made up of sand and sandstone. But all these coastal erosion, sea level rise, storm surges are really affecting us. We have lost a lot of the island. We are shrinking, but we do have all these new technologies that are available, they're affordable, and we can mobilize communities to start adapting to climate change. And so we're measuring at the Climate Lab and the new climate school at the University of Prince Edward Island. Is living shorelines the answer? I'm not really sure, but certainly in working with nature rather than fighting with her probably is. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Adam, very much for those examples that show that climate change is real for Canada. We have to do something about it. There are some questions that have come in from the panel, from the audience. But first, I'd like to ask if Paul or Adam have questions for each other. Paul, why don't you go first?
Thank you, John. Adam, great presentation, and thank you for your leadership. Doing a great job. Adam, the challenges affecting PEI are not completely unique to PEI. They are certainly very much of concern and very real. What kind of lessons have been learned elsewhere in the world about options and choices and things that can be done for PEI and for other coasts in Canada?
Well, we're learning from everywhere. I mean, the idea of working with nature rather than fighting against it isn't our idea. And I had witnessed just visiting different Caribbean islands in my role as conducting vulnerability assessments, seeing what some of the engineering firms, a lot of times they're Canadian firms, are doing in places like Barbados. And, they're putting in such things as breakwater groins, which are just a series of stones leading out to do similar things. So I think we can learn a lot because, the seas have the same type of energy, the same type of strength, storms even at stronger wind strengths. So, it's just a matter of looking around the world and taking some advice from them. Living shorelines in British Columbia, they're doing a much better job than us in terms of putting the living shorelines in place and them making a huge difference. For British Columbia, it's more the cost. They're finding they're successful, first of all, but the cost is just almost a fraction of what putting in the hard armoring, those big stones cost, and the engineering cost. Here in PEI, they don't recommend armoring the provincial government for two reasons. One, costs a lot of money. You have to engineer. I told you we don't have any hard stone. We have to import that stone. And the second reason is it doesn't work. It works in the short term, but in the longer term, it doesn't. And so, you'll be constantly replacing significant amounts of money. And sometimes here on PEI, we've noticed that if you armor, you're hurting your neighbor's property because it's not absorbing all of the energy from the sea. It's deflecting it to the neighbor's property. So we're not much of a litigious group here on PEI, but certainly in certain other parts of the country and around the world, they might sue their neighbors for putting up seawalls.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We've got a few questions that have come in from the floor, and they changed the focus a little bit from what we've been talking up to now, which is a lot of geoengineering and geophysics and like, to questions of economics, which are clearly very important. And I might just take these are from Manfred, and I'll take this 3 or 4 of them together, if I may, and then we'll see where it goes. But for a long time, we've recognized that we can't do everything everywhere, that you have to look for priorities. And one of the ways of looking at priorities is to take it down to smaller and smaller level. And it always occurred to me that municipalities are where the impacts are often the greatest, but it's not the place where the resources are the greatest. And we've seen a lot of governments downloading responsibility more and more onto municipalities, lower levels of government. So we've got this really difficult conundrum of squaring the circle here. How can we tackle what are for short-term but very immediate problems at the same time where the resources are not always been available? So Paul or Adam, would you like to comment on the economics of this issue?
I don't mind going first. Before being part of the economics faculty at the university, I used to work in the Department of Finance, and I used to work in the Premier's office. So I certainly have had some experience on the political side. Academics love to give advice to politicians. This is ultimately a political choice. It is absolutely correct. The majority of the public infrastructure in Canada is owned by municipalities. Most of what needs to be replaced, most of what needs to be taken care of is municipally owned. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of provincial and to some extent federal infrastructure as well. But municipalities own most of the infrastructure in our country, and they are doing their best to step up. But for financial reasons and other capacity, I mean, do local officials have all the knowledge and information to deal with this? One of the things that our Canadian system is doing a good job on is things like developing national standards and national codes so that publicly available to every level of government in every part of the country, here's a documentation of the best things to do. Having that knowledge increasingly and readily available all across the country, that's a role the government of Canada is stepping up to do. It's not easy, and they're putting a lot of time and effort, but giving that national guidance about what it is you would do, trying to work with various different agents so you have knowledge about what the climate will be. If you make that local decision that you want to have your infrastructure ready for the future climate, Adam was just giving the example, are you looking out 10 years or are you looking out 100 years or 200 years? So having the climate knowledge so that you can fit into how you make your decisions available. Again, the government of Canada and a number of institutions are working really, really hard to anticipate the climate and make that available to whatever level of government want to do with it. At the end of the day, though, infrastructure costs a lot of money. Money needs to be spent. And where does that funding come from? There is a policy conversation that's going on where municipalities sometimes start by saying, please give us the money. Personally, I've always been uncomfortable a little bit with that. And if the money is being spent to protect a particular community, it's infrastructure for people who are benefiting in that community. An expectation that a fair amount of the municipal part is managed by the local community and it's raised through local taxes to pay for local benefit. But that's a political conversation that is perhaps outside of where we are today. There is an active discussion. Where does the money come from? The government of Canada is stepping up. The provinces are supporting the municipalities. Are they doing enough? That conversation is not over. That's continuing. I happen to think when you do reflect on, hey, this is infrastructure to help the local community, and you can raise local taxes. It's just not easy, but it is to do something that everybody will see. That holding pond, Adam, it needs to move. And so does somebody in Toronto and Montreal get excited to buy that? But if you are in the community and you need a treatment facility that doesn't get washed away when the sea level rises, that's an incredible local issue that needs to be funded. Having national support and provincial support for that is critical. But does all the money have to come nationally and provincially? I'm not so sure of. Anyway, it's a debate for people to have, and I don't think that debate will end anytime soon. But it's a great question about where the resources come to get on with this. Infrastructure requires more money. Some other things you can just change your behavior a little bit, but for infrastructure, this is meaningful and you want to get it right. If you get it wrong, it's going to cost you even more than the high cost it'll be otherwise. But John, I hope that was helpful. And Adam, over to you.
And it's not so much that it's just the sewage lagoon that gets lost to there. If that sewage lagoon spills over, that's Malpeque Bay. So that's where, the best oysters in the whole world come from. So if you're like me and enjoy your shellfish, you don't want that $1 million shellfish industry shut down for weeks while everything gets flushed out of that bay. Paul made the good point that it's expensive, amen. It is expensive. I don't want this one to be seen as me whining. I just want you to think of it as more just the reality is I want to talk about a little fishing village, a working fishing village called Victoria by the Sea in Prince Edward Island. Human population is just over 100 people. It's a big tourist area, but their major seawall broke down, cracked about 6 years ago, and just got worse and worse until the water was finally and they, the municipality there, which it is incorporated. Most areas of PEI are not incorporated as municipalities. They went to the feds. They said go to the province. Province said go to the feds. So nobody wanted to step forward and do it until the water was seeping so much it was going up into the roads, the main roads. It was flooding a house of this wonderful older woman named Lillian, who refused to leave a house that was it was used to be the customs house. It was willed to her so that she was 82 years old, and she wouldn't leave until the water reached the top of her mattress on her bed. And that happened a few times. So I think the publicity from that was just becoming a bit too much. Feds and provinces stepped in, cost over $1 million that they put in. Large, huge, again, these granite rocks that everybody thinks look really ugly, but it'll probably protect things for a good 10 years. You can see them shifting already after just 1 year, but it should stand tall for, you might need to shift some around, but I'll say it'll last 10 years. But, $1 million here in PEI, $1 million every 10 years, that's a lot of money. And I'll tell you, the tax base for little Victoria by the Sea, we got some lobster fishermen and we got some crab fishermen and some halibut fishermen. They're not going to be the ones who can afford to replace this in 10 years. So there's some real serious work needs to be going into thinking how we're going to rebuild infrastructure, adapt the infrastructure for the coming challenges.
Very much, Adam. Sure, this is going to be essential to whatever the government proposes for its adaptation plan, which is a long time in coming. But clearly, there needs to be an allocation of resources to different projects, which are the more important ones to be tackled. It's also the matter of the allocation of resources to different levels of government. So this is clearly a knotty problem. So thank you, Mantra, for the question. I hope this is progressed the discussion a little bit, but I'd like to go back to some geotechnical questions. Art Hunter has asked about the Northumberland Bridge, both the shoreline on both sides and the span support columns. And what is the vulnerability there, and what success do you think we've engineered into that vulnerability? Adam, can you say anything to elaborate on that?
This is we're talking about the Confederation Bridge, which links Prince Edward Island to mainland Canada. It's they're just under 13 kilometers long. It was built 22 years ago, and I'll happily say it was the first major infrastructure project that I know of in Canada that took climate change into account. So they did design the system or the bridge for two specific things. One for the rising sea levels, for the additional meter, although a lot of the science says nowadays that's not going to be enough, even though the IPCC remains in that camp. I'm not in the camp to think that it's only going to be 1 meter. I'm suggesting to engineers to double that, but that just makes the cost exponential. The other thing too was the sea ice freeze up, and it's because the bridge is the longest bridge in the world that has freezing underneath it. And so they designed the bridge in such a way that would break up the ice that's coming in and out and that flows in that system that I said about the tidal activity that comes in twice a day. Now that's caused us a problem. See, when the ice in the Northumberland Strait, when the ice was solid, it protected the shore from the waves that were coming in. But when it gets broken up, the ice acts like a knife, and it looks like literally this huge knife that somebody's taken and just dug right into the coastline, the very fragile coastlines of Prince Edward Island. You can see these large things of where the ice has gone back and forth. So, it probably helped for the structural nature of the bridge itself. But in terms of assisting us with adapting to climate change, I think it's going in the other direction. Another interesting thing is, just as a little aside here, is that we've been examining the lightning strikes in the Prince Edward Island area. So lightning strikes from cloud to ground. And it's hard to tell because we only have data from the year 2000 to today, but there's this huge line that crosses the island right where the bridge comes across. So I don't know if anybody's ever examined whether a bridge like that would conduct electricity. It's also higher ground in PEI, so that could be the factor. But it'd be a really interesting research study to see whether or not that bridge has been attributing to additional storm activity, certainly lightning activity as well. But the bridge is safe. We're just not as happy with what it's done to the natural environment that the impacts weren't anticipated previously when they put this in. There was an environmental assessment done. I have a copy of it from probably about 25 years ago now.
Thank you very much, Adam. I wonder if I could turn the discussion to a slightly different direction. As I've written in the past, adaptation to climate change seems to be a bit of a Cinderella, that more attention is being devoted to mitigation, to emission reductions. And there are obviously some very solid arguments justifying that. But there seems to me that there are what I used to refer to as ancillary benefits, where these are not totally isolated sort of policy areas, that there are some things that you can do to tackle mitigation that would also benefit adaptation. And one thinks of some of those ecological things, for example, using mangroves around tropical shorelines to resist shore erosion, but at the same time those mangroves take up carbon dioxide. So there are examples of these ancillary benefits where you can tackle two issues at the same time. I wonder if you've got any suggestions of other areas where you can have these ancillary benefits tackling emission reductions that would also have some benefits to adaptation. Paul, Adam would like to go first.
I don't mind starting. I'm not going to directly answer your question, John, so I'm apologizing for that in advance, but I'll comment in the space here. I think everybody in the country would be aware that Canada's had a climate change plan focused on emissions reduction. We've had several of them over a period of at least 25 years now. And we made some commitments in Paris about emissions reduction, and that was a big part of this election and the national conversation about emissions. And the conversation has been about the various plans various governments in Canada nationally have committed us to, and where we are, largely where we failed to get to in terms of achieving some of what we were looking to do on our emissions plan. But that space has been documented, discussed at length in our country, and most of us are aware there's a lot more needed. From the beginning of the global conversation, there was to be an emission strategy and an adaptation strategy for the world and for countries. Canada does not have an adaptation strategy. The current government did make a commitment more than a year ago that it is in the process of coming up with one, and that it should be ready next year. I think the end of next year. But anyway, there's one underway and a conversation so that we can have our first adaptation strategy for our country. And some of us who work in this space have been hoping for this for a long time. So I'm excited this conversation is working toward a formal document and a formal national strategy that we might see before the end of next year. or we look to see and hope to see and expect to see before the end of next year. Participating in the early conversation, there's a lot to be done. We are quite a way away from figuring out what it is we're going to say. We've made commitments in Paris for emissions reductions. Less discussed was we also made commitments for adaptation in Paris, and also commitments to measure and keep track of how we're doing on all of these different things. Adam started with that about the importance of constantly monitoring and knowing exactly where we are. And on the adaptation side, we don't have a strategy yet, but we are now starting to work on it, which is good. And we have made some commitments, and we're starting to measure whether we're making progress against those. But there is quite a bit to be done on the broader adaptation file to bring it up toward the kind of level to the conversation that's happening in our country about emissions reduction. This is not an alternative. This is two conversations that are both urgently needed in our country, one that's further along and not complete. So the emissions conversation is much to be done and much more to be talked about and much more action to be taken. But the adaptation conversation is in need of even more energy, in my opinion. The part that has excited me, while the national conversation about adaptation has struggled for certainly 25 years, there are a number of provinces and a number of cities that are well along, and they are doing some really important work on adaptation. They have documented their goals, objectives. They have detailed plans. There are a number of exciting areas where progress is taking place on the adaptation file, but we don't have a national conversation. We do not yet know how Canada will fit this conversation. John, trying to come back to your specific question about the opportunity to deal with adaptation and mitigation at the same time. Adam touched on, and many of us are excited about green infrastructure as a way to adapt our society, and it'll also do good things about emissions reduction. And so there are opportunities that will arise, but for me, a starting point is I'm really looking forward to having a national adaptation strategy by the end of next year. I think that will help drive the conversation, just as having an emissions reduction strategy allowed many players with many points of view to come in and talk about emissions reduction. So thanks, Sean.
Well, Adam, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. My worlds collided this morning because I was on the phone with Infrastructure Canada in Ottawa, and they were late in arriving because they said they were at a meeting for developing this adaptation plan, this national adaptation plan. So like you, Paul, I'm really pleased that it's moving forward. It was part of the current government's election platform. So it's good to see. I hadn't realized there was a time frame put on it. So that still seems too long, but hey, we got to live with the slowness of government. A few years ago, my research lab was commissioned by the provincial government to come up with an adaptation plan for Prince Edward Island. They had an engineering or energy firm do the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the mitigation, but I think people have difficulty in understanding what adaptation is really about, which is essentially just living with climate change. It's happening all around us. It's going to get worse in many cases. So there are many challenges that we're being faced with. A lot of opportunities too. We can take advantage of some of these changes that are happening. So we developed this probably too long report. It's in a couple of hundred pages with almost 100 recommendations, but it lays out a pretty clear plan in multiple sectors and subject areas that we should be, implementing some adaptation activities. And the provincial government has picked up on it, and they tend to focus on more of the opportunities that are emerging. Well, it depends as well if you're a glass half full or half empty kind of person, because, like looking at crop varieties to see which ones will thrive and survive under a warmer, drier climate. That's what we've been experiencing here on Prince Edward Island the last 50 years. Things have gotten drier, well, certainly during the summer, as well as warmer. So having a crop strategy or a crop study to look at, what varieties of potatoes should we be moving towards, right? Because here on PEI, we all know, but I'm sure our listeners don't, that the russet Burbank is the potato that the McDonald's restaurants want from us, because it's a long potato, so we can get those long fries, and it's very insensitive to bruising, so they become nice white long fries. But they're not really designed for growing here on PEI with our environment. And so it's leading to new varieties being developed, as well as moving into different forms of agriculture, that are not so intensive and on our fragile lands here as well. So in many ways, climate change, it's not just the climate change issue I'm finding nowadays. It's really our relationship with the natural environment, and that we're redefining and redesigning. And adaptation seems to not fight much against nature, work better with it, and kind of accept the situation that you have. If we have more drought conditions and we don't then, all of a sudden use up our groundwater for irrigation, we suggest that, well, maybe we should have crops that don't need as much water. So that's adaptation that I think is really helping society. If we can set out these specific plans, and I suppose that's how this national adaptation strategy, I hope it's as specific as possible, or at least have an implementation plan as well that takes us every 5 to 10 years, because that's what we try to do for the province here in Prince Edward Island.
Thank you, Adam. I've been retired now for some 15 years. When I started my retirement, it was the beginning of some discussions on adaptation within the federal government. And as somebody said rather dramatically, most of those public servants involved in these discussions really didn't get it. They really didn't understand what adaptation meant. And it's been an exercise in frustration, I think, for many of us. So there's some hope that the government is taking this seriously. And as we've learned, although not with great fanfare, that the federal government intends to bring forward a strategy by the end of next year, which some of us would readily admit is too slow. Is there a possibility that we can help in accelerating that forward with this sort of discussion and other similar ones that we've had? But I wonder if either Paul or Adam can suggest what they would like to see in a federal strategy. What is the contents that would be useful? Paul.
And if I can go first, because unfortunately I need to leave the call in about 5 minutes for another one that I'm getting to. So at the moment, I've been part of the federal conversation and been able to join in with a number of people giving advice as the federal national adaptation strategy is moving forward. I'm also chair of the Ontario Advisory Committee on Climate Change, where we've been tasked by the Ontario government to think about resilient communities, resilient infrastructure, and resilient homes. So very much an adaptation forming of what we're doing. And we're working with 30 or 40 local governments specifically to bring science into the conversation about how local governments get ready for climate change. If I was looking for one piece, I'm looking for the federal adaptation strategy. The process that's been committed to by the Government of Canada is to come up with a national adaptation strategy. The promise is to invite everybody who has something to say, private sector, local, provincial. If you're doing something about adaptation, we'll put you somewhere in the book. And this will be a nice collection of a lot of things that are underway in our country. And that book is coming together. And that'll be a very useful reference and will help the conversation about adaptation move forward. What I really hope the government of Canada brings to that conversation is a very detailed promise by what the government of Canada is doing. We had the question earlier about where money comes from. So what is the government of Canada able or willing to commit to in terms of its spending? The government of Canada does a lot of things that aren't money. I mean, they're providing resources and knowledge and a whole series of things that are happening within the government of Canada. The government of Canada gives money for infrastructure, has nothing to do with climate change. And so, how is climate change being mainstreamed into that process of the money that's already being offered for today's topic on public infrastructure? Anyway, I would love more clarity about the government of Canada's commitment to adaptation. The government of Canada has been very clear on behalf of the people of Canada about what Canada is saying we're doing on emissions. And the government of Canada is committed to pull together this document by the end of next year about what all different parties are doing about adaptation. So it'll be a very interesting document. But I would really, just one thing that I'm encouraging the government of Canada to do is to be as specific as they can about the role the government of Canada will play to promote adaptation in Canada for infrastructure, for communities, for homes, for right across the board. What is the government of Canada doing now and committing to do for the foreseeable future to advance adaptation in our country?
Thank you very much, Paul. And if I don't get a chance before you leave, thank you for participating in this. It's been very useful to have all your background and your knowledge. And I do hope that we keep in touch. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Adam,
thanks, John. Thanks, Adam.
What would you like to see in the federal adaptation plan strategy?
Well, I guess, except for the money, I've kind of built a career here on Prince Edward Island is in the application of new technologies to adaptation. And the reason I've been able to do that is the new technologies are very accessible, both in terms of cost and in terms of complexity. I developed Clive, this MIT award-winning video or visualization tool that's assisted and with helping communities across North America and dealing with coastal erosion and sea level rise. I had two undergraduate students programming in a shareware that's available free of charge. So that's how this accessibility is upon us now. And I'm talking about things like big data analytics. There's some tools that make it very easy to look at all that data, reams of data, millions of data points that we look at to understand how the climate is impacting on things and how we might respond to it. I'm talking about things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, so that it helps us in these repetitive tasks or these really relatively mundane tasks. The report that I told you about where we looked at every single meter, we had somebody literally looking at every single meter on this computer system. So now we've designed programming, just written some code that does that automatically for us. Things like 3D printing. We've needed to use 3D printing to adapt a lot of our drones to accept the types of sensors that we're putting on them, so that we can understand the changing environments we're living in. Not just for coasts, we're using them for precision agriculture as well to help farmers be more efficient and more environmentally friendly on the land. That brings us to drone technology as well. So the drones, affordable. Our workhorse drones cost $2,000 or less, so they're very accessible. And the last one, virtual reality. This idea of creating these virtual environments in which we can visualize and show different communities for planning purposes, what life might look like in the future, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now. So we can speed up environmental change that normally takes so long, because environment or climate change is this creeping, right? They call it creeping climate change. So we can speed up that process to say, well, this is what it might look like, and this is what the future is going to look like. So how does that change where you're going to put your home that you want to survive for 100 years, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of technologies that are available that just need a bit of training, a bit of incentive, but they're affordable. They're not as complex, and they've moved out of that research phase so that they're more day to day, and we can utilize them for the appropriate purposes. But that would be something I'd be looking for in a national adaptation plan, that we're bringing everybody up, to the 21st century and learning about, how to utilize all of the strengths we have as humans now to try and, correct the mistakes that we've made or live with the mistakes we've made.
John, Adam, thank you for the opportunity to participate, and thank you for putting such an excellent session together. All the best as we move forward. Thank you, John. Thank you, Adam.
Good to see you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that. I think we can draw this session to a close soon. I said we'd talk for an hour and a half, and that's almost up. We've covered a lot of ground. We've been talking about funding, clearly. Who's funding and where? What are the priorities? I would hate to see that just spin continually over the next few years. Just talk. It's evident to everyone who's involved on this call and others that climate change is real, and we're running out of space and time. And we have not been acting fast enough. We've got technologies. We've got technologies that Adam was referring to. Technologies that are in engineers' heads, or engineers' reports, which we need to bring together with the new technologies that we're developing. But there is money. It's just not clear where it should be spent first. I think the sense I have is that this federal government is way behind developing this strategy for adaptation. It needs to be accelerated and brought to a head sooner rather than later. I see we seem to have run out of questions. So thank you all of you for participating in this. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Paul. And I pass it now back to Roy.
Okay, well, let me just add my thanks to that of John, to both Adam and to Paul, who just left us. It's clear that there is a lot of, I'm sorry, I can't turn on my video for some reason. There we are. There's a lot of work to be done in the next year as this adaptation plan comes together. So we've certainly raised this issue in our conference at a very opportune time. Let me also add that there's a bit of a paradox in that success in adaptation efforts is often measured in terms of disasters avoided. So it's actually hard to measure one's success if you're not really experiencing the disaster that would have happened had you not adopted these adaptation projects. Anyway, that being the case, I think we do need to develop tools and methodologies, many of which have been raised by Adam in his work, which would be very interesting and will certainly be incorporated in our report on this conference. So with that, let's bring this interesting session to an end, and let me remind our listeners that we're resuming the conference on Monday at 1 o'clock with a panel on food adaptation, and that will be the next in our series of webinars. The one after that is on Tuesday, and there will be a panel on health. So thank you all for participating. Thank you for our audience for raising such good questions, and we look forward to seeing you in subsequent sessions. And thank you to John for chairing.
Goodbye all.